Before we begin, take a deep breath and settle in. What you're about to hear are stories of real people, real mysteries, and moments that still have no answers. Here on ChapmanCrime, we explore the strange, the tragic, and the unexplained. From haunting disappearances and unsolved murders to stories that seem to defy logic. Each case you'll hear tonight is told with respect to the victims and their families. Some of these stories will stay with you long after the video ends, not because they're frightening, but because they remind us how fragile the truth can be. If you enjoy exploring mysteries that still echo through time, you're in the right place. This is ChapmanCrime, where every story hides a secret. In May 1980, 32-year-old Dorothy Jane Scott vanished after leaving a hospital in Anaheim, California. She was a devoted single mother who worked quietly behind the scenes at a local medical supply company. She wasn't known for nightlife or risk, but for kindness. Yet someone had been watching her. Someone who knew where she lived, where she worked, and how to terrify her. For months before her disappearance, Dorothy had been receiving phone calls from an anonymous man. Sometimes he professed his love. Other times he threatened her life. He described what she was wearing, where she'd been, and details about her day no stranger should have known. Dorothy told her friends she recognized the voice, but couldn't place it. Police encouraged her to be cautious. She began carrying a Bible and considered buying a gun. On the night of May 28th, Dorothy attended an employee meeting, leaving her 4-year-old son with her parents. During the meeting, one of her co-workers suddenly fell ill. Dorothy drove him and another colleague to the UC Irvine Medical Center. She waited with them until the sick man was treated and discharged around 11 p.m. Before leaving, she said she'd go get the car and pick them up at the entrance. Minutes later, her white Toyota station wagon sped past the hospital doors, headlights blinding, moving too fast to stop. Her co-workers assumed she was rushing home to check on her son, but Dorothy never came home. Early the next morning, her car was found abandoned and burned out in an alley about 10 miles away. There was no sign of Dorothy. Weeks later, her parents began receiving the same type of calls that had haunted their daughter. The man said he'd killed her. Each time he called when Dorothy's mother was alone. Police tapped the phone, but the calls were too short to trace. They continued for years, taunting, cruel, and always ending before a trace could be made. Then in August 1984, construction workers discovered skeletal remains in a remote area southeast of Anaheim. DNA confirmed they belonged to Dorothy Jane Scott. Her watch had stopped at 12:30 a.m., roughly an hour after she was last seen alive. Despite numerous suspects and investigations, her killer was never identified. No fingerprints, no witnesses, and no more calls after the discovery of her remains. Dorothy's story stands as one of Southern California's most chilling cold cases. A quiet woman targeted by an unseen predator who seemed to enjoy the fear he caused. To this day, no one knows who the caller was or how he stayed hidden so long. All that remains are the phone calls, the voice of a killer who made the darkness personal, and the mystery of a mother who vanished into the night. On December 4th, 2005, the body of 30-year-old Swedish woman Annie Borgesson was discovered on a cold, windswept beach in Ayrshire, Scotland. The tide had pulled her close to shore near Prestwick Airport, a quiet coastal stretch lined with dunes and seagrass. What at first appeared to be a tragic drowning soon became one of Scotland's most puzzling mysteries. Annie was a warm, independent woman who had moved to Edinburgh a few years earlier. She worked in the city's education sector, loved traveling, and had a close circle of friends. Just 2 days before her death, she seemed happy and made plans for the coming holidays. But on December 3rd, something changed. Security cameras at Edinburgh's bus station captured Annie boarding a bus to Prestwick, about 80 miles away. No one knew why she was heading there. She wasn't carrying much luggage, and she hadn't told anyone she planned to travel. When her body was discovered the next morning, her handbag was missing. Her hair appeared freshly washed, and her passport and wallet were found nearby in the sand. Scottish police ruled her death a suicide, saying she had likely walked into the water intentionally, but her family in Sweden immediately questioned that conclusion. They pointed out bruises on her body, including marks that suggested she had been restrained. Friends said she'd seemed upbeat and had no reason to harm herself. The family also learned that Annie's phone had been used after her death, and that some of her contacts had mysteriously been deleted. Her mother traveled to Scotland and began her own investigation. She was shocked to find that several details didn't add up. The beach where Annie was found was rough, with strong tides that made it unlikely her body would appear so neatly near the shore. Her bag and coat were missing, and witnesses later reported seeing someone matching Annie's description arguing with a man near the station the night before. Over the years, multiple theories have emerged. Some believe Annie may have been the victim of foul play, possibly connected to someone she knew. Others think she may have stumbled upon something or someone she shouldn't have. A few suggest she may have been meeting someone at the airport. Despite renewed calls to reopen the case, authorities have never changed their ruling. For Annie's family, the pain is twofold: the loss itself and the unanswered questions that came with it. Nearly 2 decades later, the image remains vivid. A young woman full of life, walking through a Scottish bus station, disappearing into the night. Her story drifts like the tide, quiet, haunting, and unresolved. What really happened to Annie Borgeson on that cold December night by the sea? On the night of August 8, 2013, 26-year-old Brandon Lawson called 911 from a remote stretch of Highway 277 near Bronte, Texas. His voice was panicked. "Yes, I'm in the middle of a field," he told the dispatcher. "My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. The guy's chasing me. Please hurry." It was the last time anyone heard his voice. Brandon was a father of 4, working in the oil fields. He was known for being hardworking and devoted to his family. That night, after an argument with his girlfriend, Ladessa Lofton, he left their home in San Angelo to cool off. He called his brother Kyle to say he'd run out of gas on the side of the highway. Kyle offered to bring him fuel, but by the time he arrived, Brandon was gone, and what he left behind raised far more questions than answers. Brandon's truck was parked awkwardly on the road's shoulder, its lights still on and the keys missing. Police arrived shortly after Kyle and found no sign of a struggle. They noted that Brandon's wallet, phone, and fuel can were gone. When they replayed the 911 call, the dispatcher and investigators couldn't agree on what Brandon had said. Some heard him mention a car, others heard, "There's one guy chasing me," and a few thought he said, "State Trooper." The call lasted less than a minute before cutting off. Over the next few hours, Brandon called and texted his brother several times saying he was bleeding and that he was 10 minutes up the road. Each time Kyle tried to find him, the location didn't match. Then around 2 a.m., Brandon's phone went dead. It was never used again. Search efforts covered miles of rugged ranch land and dense brush. Helicopters, cadaver dogs, and volunteers combed the area for days. No trace of him was found. For years, the case became an online obsession, with countless people analyzing the 911 recording and building theories, from a tragic accident to foul play, or even mistaken pursuit by someone in authority. Nearly 9 years later, in 2022, partial remains were finally discovered in the area near where Brandon's truck had been abandoned. DNA confirmed his identity, but how he died remains uncertain. There was no clear cause of death and no evidence pointing to anyone else's involvement. The mystery of Brandon Lawson endures not only because of how he disappeared, but because of that haunting 911 call, filled with confusion and fear. What did he see out there on that dark Texas highway? Who was or what was chasing him? And why did his final words sound like a warning from a place no one could reach in time? On the afternoon of December the 2nd, 2010, the body of 24-year-old Phoebe Hansjuk was found at the bottom of a garbage chute in her Melbourne apartment building. The discovery shocked investigators, not just because of how she died, but because almost nothing about the scene made sense. Phoebe was creative, intelligent, and full of life. She was an artist, photographer, and avid writer. Friends described her as passionate and spontaneous, but also struggling with anxiety and bouts of depression. That year, she had been living with her boyfriend, Anthony Hampel, in a luxury high-rise known as the Balenciaga Apartments, a sleek building overlooking St. Kilda Road. On the day of her death, Phoebe was alone in the apartment. Anthony told police he'd been at work. Security cameras later captured Phoebe entering the building's mailroom that afternoon, seemingly calm, carrying her keys and a drink. It was the last time she was seen alive. A few hours later, a janitor discovered her body in a garbage room at the base of the chute, 12 floors below her apartment. Investigators quickly determined she had entered the chute from her floor, feet first, and fallen more than 30 meters. The scene appeared impossible. The opening of the chute was small, just 37 centimeters wide, positioned more than a meter off the ground. An awkward space that would require significant effort to climb into. The official explanation was that Phoebe's death was a tragic accident, possibly fueled by prescription medication and alcohol. But her family refused to accept that. They pointed to inconsistencies, a broken glass nearby that had her blood on it, scratches on her legs, and phone messages suggesting she planned to meet friends later that evening. Experts who examined the chute argued it would be nearly impossible for someone to climb in voluntarily without help. And even if she had, why would she do it? Investigators found no sign of struggle or forced entry, but they also couldn't explain how she ended up there. An inquest in 2014 ruled Phoebe's death as accidental, citing intoxication and confusion. Yet many, including forensic specialists, believe the investigation overlooked key evidence. Her grandfather, a retired police detective, described the case as one of the most baffling he'd ever seen. Years later, public interest in Phoebe's story remains strong. True crime experts, journalists, and podcasters continue to re-examine the evidence. Was it an accident or something darker hidden behind the walls of that luxury apartment? The story of Phoebe Hansjuk lingers because it sits on the edge of logic. A young woman full of life, a chute too small to make sense, and an official conclusion that still doesn't feel right. Her case reminds us that sometimes the truth doesn't fall neatly into place. On the morning of March 22, 2011, 24-year-old Rebecca Coriam failed to show up for her shift aboard the Disney Wonder cruise ship. The vessel, sailing between Mexico and the U.S., had already left port when the crew realized she was missing. Despite a frantic search, Rebecca was nowhere to be found. To this day, no one knows what happened to her. Rebecca was from Chester, England, cheerful, athletic, and adventurous. She'd worked with Disney for over a year, responsible for youth activities on board. Friends described her as outgoing, responsible, and always smiling. The night before she vanished, security cameras captured her walking through the crew lounge around 5:45 a.m., wearing men's clothing and speaking on a phone. She appeared upset. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. When she didn't report for work later that morning, crew members searched her cabin. Her personal belongings, including her passport and ID, were still there. The ship's security team began reviewing CCTV footage, and a man overboard alert was eventually raised. But by then, the Disney Wonder was hundreds of miles from the nearest port. Disney reported that Rebecca had likely been swept overboard by a rogue wave while standing on an open deck. But her family and many maritime investigators found that explanation unconvincing. The weather that morning had been calm. The area Disney identified as the likely spot of her fall had high safety railings, and no clear evidence she'd been there. Even stranger, the ship continued its voyage as usual, docking later that day in Mexico. The Bahamian authorities, responsible for the investigation since the ship was registered in the Bahamas, sent a single officer to inspect the scene. He stayed only a few hours, interviewed a handful of crew members, and left with little documentation. Rebecca's parents later traveled to meet the ship when it returned to port. They were led to her cabin and shown CCTV footage of her final moments, which they described as deeply troubling. They've since said that Disney provided few answers and tightly controlled information about the investigation. Over the years, witnesses have come forward claiming to have seen Rebecca after her official time of disappearance, though none of those reports were ever verified. Independent investigators believe her case highlights the lack of oversight and accountability in international waters, where jurisdiction becomes blurred. More than a decade later, the mystery remains. What really happened to Rebecca Coriam aboard the Disney Wonder? A young woman full of life walking through the quiet corridors of a ship that never stopped sailing, vanishing somewhere between the stars and the sea. On the morning of August 30th, 2013, police found an overturned car at the bottom of a small embankment near Castaic Lake, California. The vehicle was empty. Inside were a phone, wallet, keys, and laptop, but no sign of its driver, 19-year-old college student Bryce Laspisa. It was the beginning of a mystery that still has no answers. Bryce was a promising art student at Sierra College, known for his charm, humor, and creativity. He had recently returned to campus for his sophomore year and lived in an apartment with friends. But just days before his disappearance, his behavior began to change. Friends noticed he was restless, emotional, and staying up late. He began giving away his belongings, including a prized Xbox and jewelry, and told his girlfriend, "You'd be better off without me." Concerned, his friends called his parents, Karen and Michael Laspisa, who lived in Southern California. When they spoke to Bryce, he sounded disoriented but insisted he was fine. Later that night, he left campus, telling friends he was driving home to see his parents, a 6-hour trip south. Throughout the night and into the next morning, Bryce's parents tracked his movements by phone. He called them several times, saying he was on the way, but repeatedly stopped for long stretches in random locations. One tow truck driver who helped him after he ran out of gas said Bryce seemed calm and polite, though distant, as if lost in thought. At 2 a.m., he told his mother he was too tired to drive and would sleep in his car. That was the last time she heard his voice. By sunrise, his car was found crashed near Castaic Lake, about 90 minutes from his home. It had rolled down a small slope and landed upside down. The back window was broken out, likely from the inside, and footprints led away toward the nearby lake. Police and volunteers searched the area for days. Drones, divers, and bloodhounds found no trace of him. There was no sign he'd drowned and no evidence of foul play. Over the years, countless theories have surfaced. Some believe Bryce suffered a mental breakdown, possibly linked to stress or substance use, and wandered off in confusion. Others think he may have started a new life, walking away intentionally. But with no confirmed sightings and no physical evidence, each possibility only deepens the mystery. Bryce Laspisa's disappearance feels like a story suspended in time. A car found in perfect silence, a trail that ends at the edge of a lake, and a family still waiting for a phone call that never came. Somewhere between that long night drive and the dawn, a young man vanished, leaving behind only questions and a haunting sense that he was trying to say goodbye. It was a warm August afternoon in 1912 when 4-year-old Bobby Dunbar vanished while on a family trip near Swayze Lake, Louisiana. The Dunbars had been fishing, laughing, and enjoying the summer day. But when they turned around, Bobby was gone. In moments, a joyful outing turned into every parent's worst nightmare. For days, hundreds of volunteers searched the swamps and forests surrounding the lake. They drained ponds, cut through thick brush, and questioned travelers passing through the area. Despite their efforts, there was no trace of the missing boy. Newspapers across the South picked up the story, calling it the disappearance of little Bobby Dunbar. Weeks passed and hope began to fade, until 8 months later, a child matching Bobby's description was found in Mississippi with a man named William Walters. Walters claimed the boy was not Bobby Dunbar but Bruce Anderson, the son of a woman who had once worked for his family. He said he'd been given permission to care for the child, but when the Dunbars saw the boy, they insisted it was their missing son. After a few days, the mother, Leslie Dunbar, broke down in tears and embraced him, convinced this was her Bobby. Walters was arrested, and the child returned home to a hero's welcome. The newspapers called it a miracle. The found boy was showered with gifts, and the Dunbars tried to resume life as normal. Walters, however, maintained his innocence, insisting he'd been wrongly accused and that the boy truly belonged to the Anderson family. His protests were ignored, and he was sentenced to prison, though he was later released. For years, the case was remembered as a story with a happy ending. A child found and a family reunited. But deep down, something never felt right. Some of the boy's features seemed slightly different, and he didn't recognize certain relatives. As time went on, whispers spread through town. Had the wrong child come home? Nearly a century later, in 2004, DNA testing provided the answer. Bobby Dunbar's granddaughter agreed to compare her family's DNA with that of the descendants of Bobby's supposed brother. The results stunned everyone. There was no genetic match. The boy raised as Bobby Dunbar was not related to the Dunbar family at all. He was, in fact, Bruce Anderson, the child William Walters had claimed all along. The real Bobby Dunbar's fate remains unknown. Whether he drowned that summer day, was kidnapped, or met some other end, no one will ever truly know. But the case became one of America's most famous identity mysteries. A story of loss, hope, and a truth uncovered generations too late. For the Dunbars and the Andersons, the story left behind more than confusion. It left a legacy about how grief can cloud judgment and how the search for answers can sometimes lead us farther from the truth. In the early morning hours of February 14, 2000, Valentine's Day, 9-year-old Asha Degree quietly packed her backpack, slipped out of her family's home in Shelby, North Carolina, and walked alone into the stormy darkness. It was cold, raining heavily, and the wind howled through the small neighborhood streets. No one knows exactly why she left or what she was looking for, But that night became one of the most baffling mysteries in modern history. Asha was a bright, shy fourth grader. Her parents, Harold and Akila, were devoted and protective, raising their children with love and structure. There were no signs of trouble at home. That night, the family went to bed after the kids returned from basketball practice. A power outage struck during the storm, and around 2:30 a.m., Asha's father checked on the children. They were both asleep. But by morning, her bed was empty and her backpack was gone. Between 3:30 and 4:15 a.m., drivers on Highway 18 spotted a small figure walking along the roadside in the heavy rain. Several described the child as wearing a white shirt and carrying a backpack. One driver even turned around to check on her, but when he circled back, she had disappeared into the darkness. By dawn, panic spread. Police and volunteers searched the woods and fields for miles. Bloodhounds traced her scent along the road before losing it at a nearby shed, where searchers found a few candy wrappers, a hairbow, and a pencil that appeared to belong to Asha. But there were no footprints, no clues to where she went next. Days turned into weeks. Hundreds of people joined the search, combing creeks, ponds, and back roads. For over a year, the case remained cold, until construction workers found Asha's backpack buried in plastic along a rural stretch of highway 30 miles away. Inside were her school papers and personal belongings. It had been intentionally wrapped and hidden. That single discovery deepened the mystery even more. Investigators explored every theory: kidnapping, accident, runaway, but nothing fit perfectly. Asha had no reason to leave home and had been afraid of the dark. Her family believed she might have trusted someone she knew or someone pretending to be friendly. The community held vigils, posted flyers, and promised to keep her story alive. 2 decades later, the mystery endures. The FBI still considers Asha's case active, and every year, her family gathers to walk the same road she once traveled. They call it Asha's Walk Home, a symbol of hope that someday she will be found. The disappearance of Asha Degree remains one of the most haunting unsolved cases in America. A child who walked into a storm and vanished, leaving behind only questions and the love of a family that refuses to stop searching. In the early morning hours of February 14, 2000, Valentine's Day, 9-year-old Asha Degree quietly packed her backpack, slipped out of her family's home in Shelby, North Carolina, and walked alone into the stormy darkness. It was cold, raining heavily, and the wind howled through the small neighborhood streets. No one knows exactly why she left or what she was looking for, but that night became one of the most baffling mysteries in modern history. Asha was a bright, shy fourth grader. Her parents, Harold and Akila, were devoted and protective, raising their children with love and structure. There were no signs of trouble at home. That night, the family went to bed after the kids returned from basketball practice. A power outage struck during the storm, and around 2:30 a.m., Asha's father checked on the children. They were both asleep. But by morning, her bed was empty and her backpack was gone. Between 3:30 and 4:15 a.m., drivers on Highway 18 spotted a small figure walking along the roadside in the heavy rain. Several described the child as wearing a white shirt and carrying a backpack. One driver even turned around to check on her, but when he circled back, she had disappeared into the darkness. By dawn, panic spread. Police and volunteers searched the woods and fields for miles. Bloodhounds traced her scent along the road before losing it at a nearby shed, where searchers found a few candy wrappers, a hairbow, and a pencil that appeared to belong to Asha. But there were no footprints, no clues to where she went next. Days turned into weeks. Hundreds of people joined the search, combing creeks, ponds, and back roads. For over a year, the case remained cold, until construction workers found Asha's backpack buried in plastic along a rural stretch of highway 30 miles away. Inside were her school papers and personal belongings. It had been intentionally wrapped and hidden. That single discovery deepened the mystery even more. Investigators explored every theory: kidnapping, accident, runaway, but nothing fit perfectly. Asha had no reason to leave home and had been afraid of the dark. Her family believed she might have trusted someone she knew or someone pretending to be friendly. The community held vigils, posted flyers, and promised to keep her story alive. 2 decades later, the mystery endures. The FBI still considers Asha's case active, and every year, her family gathers to walk the same road she once traveled. They call it Asha's Walk Home, a symbol of hope that someday she will be found. The disappearance of Asha Degree remains one of the most haunting unsolved cases in America. A child who walked into a storm and vanished, leaving behind only questions and the love of a family that refuses to stop searching. On March 22, 1977, 39-year-old Charles Morgan vanished from his home in Tucson, Arizona. He was a well-known escrow agent, quiet, meticulous, and a father of 4. His disappearance shocked his family, but what followed was even stranger. 3 days later, Charles stumbled back home in the middle of the night, barefoot, disoriented, and terrified. His wife, Ruth, said he couldn't speak. When she tried to help him, he motioned for a pen and wrote that he'd been kidnapped and had his throat painted with a hallucinogenic chemical. He claimed that if he talked, his family would be in danger. Ruth tried to call the police, but Charles refused, insisting the people behind his abduction were watching. For the next several days, he lived in fear. He carried a gun, wore a bulletproof vest, and told his wife he was working with government agents on a secret case involving organized crime. 2 months later, on June 18th, his body was found in the desert west of Tucson, shot once in the back of the head. His own handgun lay beside him. Authorities quickly ruled the death a suicide. But almost nothing about the scene made sense. Charles was wearing his bulletproof vest. A tooth was missing. And in his car, police found a note with cryptic directions, 2 sets of license plates, ammunition, and a map of the area. The most bizarre detail, a $2 bill clipped inside his underwear, marked with strange codes, Spanish names, and Bible verses referencing the coming of judgment. Ruth didn't believe it was suicide. She said her husband had been frightened for weeks and had hinted that he was working with law enforcement to expose money laundering operations tied to both the mob and government officials. Several anonymous tips came in after his death, claiming Charles had been silenced, but no proof ever surfaced. Days after the discovery, a woman calling herself Green Eyes phoned local police. She said she'd met with Charles before his death and that he'd shown her a briefcase filled with documents linking powerful figures to criminal deals. She hung up before revealing her identity. Police were never able to find her. The official investigation stalled, leaving more questions than answers. If Charles had truly been murdered, who wanted him dead? And why stage it to look like suicide? And what did the coded messages mean? Nearly 50 years later, the case remains one of Arizona's strangest. Every theory, from secret agents and organized crime to elaborate conspiracy, ends in mystery. Charles Morgan's story has become a legend of the desert, a man who claimed to know too much, who vanished twice, and whose final words may have been written on a $2 bill that still defies explanation. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Every view, like, and comment helps these stories reach more people and keeps the memory of those still missing or unsolved alive. If you'd like to help the channel grow, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're listening from and which story stayed with you most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the truth is often stranger than we think. This is Chapman Crime.